Deep in the cold black hollows of West Virginia, a 12-year-old girl named Mabel Corey, in the summer of 1923, received a gift that would haunt 3 generations. It wasn't a doll. It wasn't jewelry. It was a marriage contract, promising her to her first cousin when she turned 16, signed in her father's shaking hand. For years later, she would walk down a dirt path to meet her fate. 9 months after that, she would give birth to something that made the local doctor pack his bags and forever leave town. The child thrived. The child lived. And 60 years later, when geneticists finally got their hands on the medical records, they found something that shouldn't exist. Something that rewrote everything we thought we knew about bloodlines, survival, and the darkest corners of American family secrets. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The arrangement and the secret clause. The Corey family didn't speak of the arrangement until the morning of Mabel's 12th birthday. She found them gathered around the kitchen table, their faces carved from the same gray stone that lined the mountain ridges above their homestead, like mourners at a wake. Her father, Ezekiel, sat with his calloused hands folded, staring at a piece of paper that seemed to burn his eyes every time he looked at it. By the window stood her mother, Ruth, with her back turned, shoulders trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The handwritten document, simple and in careful script, promised Mabel Corey to her cousin Thomas Corey, son of Ezekiel's brother, Samuel, when she reached her 16th year. The bloodline would remain pure. The families would unite their land holdings. The arrangement, they told her, was a tradition stretching back to the old country, back to times when survival meant keeping everything, money, land, secrets, within the family circle. But there was something they didn't tell her that morning. Something written in smaller print at the bottom of the contract, in words too clinical for a child's understanding. This was a clause that referenced genetic consultation and bloodline compatibility studies, conducted by a traveling doctor who had visited both families the previous winter. This wasn't just about land or tradition. This was about something darker, something experimental, something that treated children like breeding stock in a laboratory that stretched across entire counties. Mabel would later remember the way her father's voice cracked when he explained that Thomas was a good boy, only 3 years older, that the families had known each other since before the mountain was carved up by coal companies. What she would remember more clearly was the sound her mother made when she thought no one was listening, a low animal keen that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. It was the sound of a woman who knew she had signed her own daughter's death warrant. The groom and the scientist. Thomas Corey wasn't like other boys in the hollow. While his cousins spent their days working the mines or hunting, Thomas collected things, dead things. Small animals that had died in winter, birds with broken wings, insects pinned to boards with their delicate legs arranged just so. He kept them in glass jars filled with solutions he mixed himself, studying the way bones held their shape long after everything else had rotted away, the way flesh preserved. When Mabel's engagement was announced, Thomas began a new collection, hair. He would appear at family gatherings with scissors hidden in his pocket, snipping locks when his young cousin wasn't looking. He pressed them between the pages of his father's medical books. Yes, medical books, because Samuel Corey wasn't just a coal miner. He was something else entirely, something the family whispered about but never named directly. Samuel had studied at a university back east before the scandal sent him fleeing to the mountains. The scandal involved experiments, genetic research that the medical establishment had deemed scientifically reckless and morally questionable. But in the isolation of West Virginia, with families that had been intermarrying for generations, Samuel found the perfect laboratory. He found subjects who would never report him to authorities, who would never ask questions, who believed that bloodline purity was worth any price. The arrangement between the families wasn't even about land or love. It was about creating the perfect test case. Mabel and Thomas shared great-grandparents on both sides. Their genetic overlap was so complete that any child they produced would be a walking experiment in human endurance. Samuel had calculated the odds, mapped the family trees, and identified every recessive gene that might surface. He expected early deaths, deformities, stillbirths. He expected to document the failures, to publish papers that would restore his reputation in academic circles. What he didn't expect was for the experiment to succeed in ways that would terrify him for the rest of his life. The wedding and the serum. The wedding took place on a Tuesday in October 1927, when the mountain maples had turned the color of dried blood and the air carried the first promise of a brutal winter. There was no white dress passed down through generations, no celebration, no church ceremony. Instead, 16-year-old Mabel walked the quarter-mile path between her father's cabin and her uncle's house, wearing her mother's only good dress, and carrying a suitcase that held everything she would ever own again. The ceremony itself lasted 7 minutes. Samuel Corey officiated, reading from a book that wasn't quite the Bible. The words were similar, but somehow wrong, twisted into something that sounded more like a medical procedure than a religious sacrament. Thomas stood beside his bride with the same distant expression he wore when examining his preserved specimens. Mabel stared at a point somewhere beyond his shoulder, her face blank as fresh snow. But it was what happened after the ceremony that the family would spend decades trying to forget. As the small gathering moved toward the cabin for what passed as a wedding dinner, Samuel pulled his son aside. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small glass vial filled with clear liquid and a leather journal bound with wire. The liquid, he explained in whispers, was to be administered to Mabel each morning with her coffee. The journal was for recording symptoms, changes, anything unusual that might occur during the pregnancy he assumed would follow quickly. The liquid wasn't medicine in any conventional sense. It was something Samuel had developed during his university days, something designed to enhance genetic expression in pregnant women. He had tested it on animals with remarkable results, offspring that displayed traits from bloodlines thought extinct, characteristics that shouldn't have been possible given the parents' genetics. Now, he would test it on his daughter-in-law, document the results, and use the data to rebuild his shattered career. What Samuel didn't tell his son was that the serum had never been tested on humans. What he didn't mention was that every animal test subject had eventually died, usually after giving birth to offspring that lived just long enough to be catalogued and studied. He didn't explain that Mabel wasn't just a bride. She was a laboratory rat in a wedding dress, walking willingly into an experiment that would consume not just her life, but the lives of children not yet conceived. Transformation and evolution. 3 months into the marriage, Mabel began changing in ways that couldn't be explained by pregnancy alone. Her hair, once mousy brown, started growing in darker at the roots, not gray, but black as cold tar. Her eyes, pale blue since birth, developed flecks of green that seemed to shift and move in lamplight. Most disturbing of all, she began speaking in her sleep, long conversations in a language that sounded almost like English, but wasn't quite right, as if the words were being pronounced by someone who had only read them in books. Thomas dutifully recorded everything in his father's journal, timing the length of her nocturnal speeches, measuring the rate of hair growth, and documenting the color changes with small sketches. But he also began experiencing changes of his own, changes he didn't record, and was afraid to admit even to himself. His dreams had become vivid and invasive, filled with memories that weren't his own. He would wake knowing things he had never learned, understanding concepts that should have been beyond his education. Samuel initially dismissed these reports as expected symptoms of a compromised genetic line, psychological effects of the inbreeding. But when he examined Mabel in her 4th month, he found something that made his hands shake as he wrote his observations. Her reflexes were enhanced beyond normal human ranges. Her blood pressure was perfect. Most impossibly, tests revealed that her IQ had increased by nearly 30 points since the wedding, as if the pregnancy was somehow optimizing her brain function rather than depleting it. The child she carried was doing something to her, rewriting her genetic code from the inside out. Samuel had theorized that extreme inbreeding might activate dormant genes. But this was beyond his wildest hypothesis. This was genetic evolution happening in real time, not just genetic expression. Complete rest into the span of a pregnancy. Mabel wasn't just carrying Thomas's child. She was carrying something that was actively improving her, transforming her into something more than human. But evolution, Samuel knew from his animal studies, always came with a price. The stronger the enhancement, the more catastrophic the eventual collapse. He began preparing for Mabel's death, documenting everything so that her sacrifice wouldn't be wasted. What he didn't prepare for was the possibility that she might survive long enough to give birth to something that would make his previous experiments look like child's games. The birth and the aftermath. The birth lasted 3 days and 2 nights, and by the end of it, Dr. Marcus Webb had seen enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about human biology. Webb had delivered hundreds of babies in his 20-year career, had seen every complication the textbooks described, and several they hadn't bothered to include. But he had never seen a newborn emerge with its eyes already open, already focused, tracking movement with the deliberate precision of a predator studying prey. The child, a girl they would name Elizabeth, was physically perfect in ways that defied medical explanation. Her reflexes were so advanced that she could support her own head weight immediately after birth. Her muscle tone was that of a 6-month-old. Most disturbing of all, she seemed to understand speech from her first breath, turning toward voices with recognition rather than the random head movements typical of newborns. When Dr. Webb performed the standard neurological tests, Elizabeth's responses fell so far outside normal parameters that he initially assumed his equipment was malfunctioning. But it was what happened to Mabel during the delivery that would haunt Dr. Webb's dreams for the remainder of his life. As the labor progressed, she began exhibiting superhuman strength, breaking the leather restraints meant to keep her stable during contractions. Her body temperature dropped to levels that should have been fatal. Yet, she remained conscious and alert. Most impossibly, the massive blood loss that should have killed her seemed to have no effect. Her body was somehow replenishing blood faster than she was losing it, as if the pregnancy had fundamentally altered her circulatory system. Samuel observed everything from the corner of the room, frantically scribbling notes while his daughter-in-law transformed into something that bore only passing resemblance to the girl who had walked down that dirt path 7 months earlier. This wasn't just successful reproduction despite dangerous genetic overlap. This was active improvement of the human species, compressed into a single generation through methods he was beginning to realize he didn't understand at all. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The walking experiment. Elizabeth Corey's childhood was a catalogue of impossibilities that the family learned to hide behind locked doors and drawn curtains. By her first birthday, she was speaking in complete sentences, not just simple words, but complex thoughts expressed with vocabulary that surpassed most adults in the hollow. By age 3, she was reading her grandfather Samuel's medical journals, asking questions about chromosomal patterns and genetic inheritance that made grown men uncomfortable. By 5, she had begun her own experiments. They started small. Elizabeth would capture small animals and insects, not to harm them, but to study them with a methodical precision that reminded everyone uncomfortably of her grandfather's work. She would document their responses to different stimuli, observe their behavior patterns, and most disturbingly, she seemed capable of predicting their actions with uncanny accuracy. It was as if she could see patterns in living systems that were invisible to everyone else. But it was her effect on other children that truly alarmed the family. Whenever Elizabeth interacted with her cousins or the few neighbor children brave enough to visit, something changed in them. They became more aware of their surroundings, more intelligent, more focused. The changes were measurable, but temporary, lasting only a few hours after exposure. Parents began reporting that their children came home from visits to the Corey place, asking sophisticated questions about mathematics and science that they shouldn't have been capable of formulating. Samuel documented everything obsessively, filling journal after journal with observations about his granddaughter's development. What he discovered terrified him more than any of his previous experiments. Elizabeth wasn't just the product of enhanced genetics. She was actively improving the genetics of everyone around her through mechanisms he couldn't begin to understand. She was somehow broadcasting genetic improvements, sharing evolutionary advantages through proximity alone. The implications were staggering. If Elizabeth could enhance human intelligence and physical capabilities simply by being near other people, what kind of children would she produce? What would happen when she reached reproductive age? And more frightening still, what would happen to the existing human population if her abilities continued to evolve and spread? The sealed report. The truth about Elizabeth Corey didn't surface until 1987, when a team of geneticists from Johns Hopkins gained access to Samuel's journals during an estate sale. What they found buried in those handwritten pages would challenge every assumption about human genetic limitations and force the scientific community to confront possibilities they had never dared to consider. Dr. Sarah Chen, leading the research team, initially approached the journals as historical curiosities, the delusional ramblings of a disgraced researcher who had retreated to the mountains to conduct unethical experiments on his own family. But as she translated Samuel's clinical observations into modern genetic terminology, she realized she was looking at documentation of something that shouldn't exist: successful human genetic modification occurring naturally through extreme inbreeding, enhanced by chemical intervention, resulting in accelerated evolution within a single generation. The blood samples that Samuel had preserved in his makeshift laboratory told an even more disturbing story. Elizabeth's genetic code contained sequences that didn't match any known human DNA patterns. More impossibly, these unknown sequences appeared to be actively rewriting themselves, adapting and improving with each cell division. She wasn't just genetically enhanced. She was genetically unstable in ways that should have been fatal, but instead seemed to be driving continuous improvement. When the research team finally tracked down Elizabeth herself, now a 60-year-old woman living under an assumed name in rural Montana, they found someone who looked decades younger than her chronological age, possessed an IQ that exceeded their testing parameters, and demonstrated physical capabilities that defied medical explanation. She had never had children, never married, and had spent her adult life moving from place to place whenever people began noticing that she never seemed to fall ill or age. The final revelation came from Elizabeth herself during what would be the only interview she ever granted to researchers. The genetic changes hadn't stopped with her birth. They were still evolving, still happening, still pushing her further from baseline humanity with each passing year. She had become something unprecedented, something new, something that made her the loneliest creature on Earth because no one else could survive the genetic modifications that had become as natural to her as breathing. The Johns Hopkins team published their findings in a classified report that was immediately sealed by federal authorities. Elizabeth Corey disappeared again, this time permanently, leaving behind only blood samples and the haunting question of what becomes of the human species when evolution moves faster than our ability to control or understand it. The Corey Mountain homestead stands empty now, but locals still report strange lights in the windows some nights, and children born in the area continue to display IQ levels that statisticians insist shouldn't be possible. Some experiments, it seems, continue long after their creators are dead and gone, and some secrets refuse to stay buried, echoing through bloodlines and reshaping humanity in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. The question isn't whether Elizabeth Corey was the first of her kind. The question is whether she was the last of ours.